I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. Back after some technical difficulties kept us off the air last week, Will. But we have an excellent couple of weeks to catch up on here. On this episode, we'll discuss two very big wins, a defensive turnaround that pretty much came out of nowhere. Rashada flips, plus recruiting and portal news, SEC championship game. We'll talk about that. That is set, plus a little Vandy preview for $1 to close it up. Will, little technical difficulties on my end last week with the computer last Thursday night. Hey, dude, we got plenty of awesome things to catch up on though, because I was really bummed out last week because last week was fun enough, and then you go through this weekend. It's just been a great couple of weeks here, man.
Yeah, well, I've actually enjoyed it. We've had a couple of people asking when Stand Up and Holler is going to come back. Did they miss it? All that sort of stuff. I hope we had one person go, I hope you didn't get rid of the feature. We didn't get rid of it. We're purchasing new computer equipment as we speak to make sure that we don't make you guys stay out in the wilderness for a week without us, though I'm sure some of you probably survived. So yeah, a lot of good stuff to talk about, right? I mean, obviously the win over South Carolina this past week, but the win over A&M the week before, coming off of Billy Napier said coming out of halftime for that Georgia game, he felt like that might be a turning point in the season, and we all went, yeah, well, we'll see. Turns out, first two games, the returns on that comment have been pretty positive. And so, we're in a lot different place than we were when it was 4-4. We're in a lot different place, I think mentally from the standpoint of the team's now bowl eligible. We're not worried about that. You got Vanderbilt coming up next week. And so there's an opportunity to go 7-5 or 7-4 heading into the game against Florida State. And 8-4 is on the table, right? I mean, the reality is we all expect to beat Vanderbilt, and then you got Florida State coming up next, and you beat a big rival. You end up 8-4. I think if you'd have told us before the season 8-4, we all would have been like, okay, it's a good season for Napier, right? So now again, if you lose to Florida State, you lose the bowl game, and you end up 7-6 at the end of the year. I think it feels different. So it's not like the job's done, but obviously we're in a lot better place now than we were 2 weeks ago, and it's fun to talk about a couple of wins.
Putting ourselves in good position here. Let's start with two bits. A 38-6 win on senior day at the Swamp against South Carolina. Well, I went to the game. It was damn near perfect day on all fronts. The weather was fantastic. The offense was steady, and the defense kept Carolina under wraps. The Gators did most of their damage on the ground, running for 374 of their 515 total yards. Johnson went for 161 in a score. ETN went for 100 in a score. And Richardson went for 96 in the score. Lethal three-headed monster in that ground game there. Richardson, though, he did struggle in the passing game with his accuracy a little bit. Did manage to throw for 2 touchdowns, but a little all over the place, kind of what we've seen this year, a little up and down from Richardson. But the running game was just so good that it really helped cover up some of those warts. Defensively, the Gators picked up where they left off at Texas A&M, forcing 3 punts in 3 possessions to open the game, and that effort helped Florida jump out to a 21-0 lead early, and the Gators never looked back. Florida held the Gamecocks to 44 yards on the ground and only allowed 193 yards passing on the night. Had some hiccups on special teams, but hey, that'll give Napier something to work on and something to get on the team about this week. So, hey, if you're putting the Alabama blueprint together, though, Will, playing almost perfect on offense and defense while screwing up a lot on special teams, that's kind of a Saban special there, right?
Well, I mean, so I think perfect is an interesting way to describe the offense. I think for the first 3 drives, you can say that. I think after that, you can you can have some nits to pick on the offensive side of the ball. The big difference, and this is what happened in the second half of the A&M game too, they gave up 23 rushes for 44 yards against South Carolina. That's a 1.9 yard per attempt average. But in the third quarter against A&M, they averaged 1.3 yards per rush. In the fourth quarter, A&M averaged 0.9 yards per rush. And so Florida has clamped down on giving up running plays. And so what's happening is the opposing offenses are ending up in 3rd and long much more often than they're ending up in 3rd and 3. And when you start combining that with the fact that they're also starting to get off the field on 3rd down, right? 4 of 13 for Texas A&M, 3 of 11 for South Carolina. The defense was the difference in this one. I mean, look, the 6 points they gave up were the special teams blunder, not the defense. Now, I mean, it was Amari Burney, I think, who was supposed to be in coverage there. So that is a defensive player who screwed that up. But still, the defense has not surrendered a legitimate point in 6 quarters. And this is a defense that was giving up 21, 28 points per quarter and just up and down the field. I mean, you had an article on Read and Reaction 3-4 weeks ago where you were detailing all the yards that they'd given up. And I mean, it was something like 80% of the yards they could have given up, they were giving up in some of those games. And in these games, they're just not giving it up at all. Now, look, I mean, A&M and South Carolina are much, much worse on offense than Tennessee or Georgia or any of the other teams they played so far, except for maybe Kentucky. And not coincidentally, Kentucky is the last team that they actually kind of stopped on the defensive side of the ball. So, I think we've all sort of looked at the opening schedule for Florida and said, yeah, they've struggled, but they played this hard schedule. And the question was, were they going to be able to turn it on when the schedule turned and was a little bit easier? And A&M obviously having a bad year. South Carolina, Spencer Rattler looked terrible and has looked pretty bad all year long. And Florida's turned the corner. And so, we've criticized Patrick Toney. We've criticized the defensive players all season long when they haven't been able to step up, when they haven't been able to execute. And now they have been able to execute. And, look, I think some of that is scheme. I think some of that is easier opponents. But I think some of it is, the departure of Brenton Cox. And now people seem to be doing their jobs rather than freelancing. And that's not just Cox. I mean, everybody was freelancing, but whatever happened when they removed him has had an effect. And you look at it, and they haven't missed a step in terms of getting pressure. Human Meelan and Power Island are getting pressure on the quarterback. Desmond Watson and Chris McClellan are doing a much better job of clogging up the middle. And what that's doing is freeing up the linebackers to get to the outside. The first drive is a great case in point. South Carolina tries to run right up the middle. Desmond Watson throws off his guy, forces him back into Power Island for a loss of 2. The next, they try a little pitch or kind of a little quick toss to the running back out to the outside. Watson again gets penetration, and Bernie doesn't have to worry about inside gaps, shoots to the outside, doesn't make the tackle, but forces him outside, and Trevez Johnson ends up making the stop. And then the third play of that drive was a throw to the outside where Jaden Hill forces the guy back inside. He actually makes the tackle, but even if he didn't make the tackle, he forces him back inside where Power Island or Human Meelan, I can't remember which one, comes over and helps with that tackle while the linebackers start making their way over too. So the little things that were turning a 2-yard gain into a 14-yard gain, they're not gone, but they are a lot less prevalent. And when you play a guy like Spencer Rattler or you play a guy like Haynes King, those guys aren't going to pick you apart when you do make the mistake. So there's probably some mistakes that we haven't seen show up because there were still guys open and just the quarterbacks haven't been able to hit them. The good news is that we've got Mike Wright or, for Vanderbilt, who's been decent, but not great. And, it's Vanderbilt. And so you expect that the quarterbacks are not going to be able to exploit those mistakes again. And Florida should be able to cruise.
We'll dive more into the defense here in 4 bits here, but just wrapping up South Carolina, felt like the old days in the swamp. This was I was expecting a good game here with a good South Carolina team. Florida takes care of business, just whoops them early, keeps it on them the entire game, improves to 6-4, and gets to bowl eligibility in the 10th game of the season here. Let's go to the A&M game real quick, Will, because we missed that last week. Let's dive in on that. Richardson throws for 201 yards and 2 touchdowns. The rushing attack, almost 300 yards, 291 on 50 attempts. Montrell Johnson, 100 yards in the TD. ETN, 80 in the TD. Richardson, 78 and 2 TDs, including a 60-yard score. And after surrendering 24 points in the first half, the Florida defense clamped down, held the Aggies to 5 punts, forced 2 fumbles, and forced a turnover and downs for a shutout in the second half, which I'm still in shock. Well, I'm still a little bit in shock that one happened, especially after the first half. You wrote a great article detailing what the defense did. And, we'll save some of that for 4 bits. But in general, what was your impression of this A&M game? Big time win. Even though it's a struggling Aggies program, we were struggling too coming in to this game. So the fact that we were able to put it together, the offense showed up, played a great game, and the defense showed up in the second half and complemented the offense so well. Man, it's exciting to see the potential that Billy Napier's putting together here, Will.
It's just a complete turnaround. I mean, they surrendered 9.3 yards per play in the first half. That's not bad. That's atrocious. So like the worst teams in FBS surrender like 7.3, 7.4 yards per play. So to do that for an entire half is just awful. Napier screws up the timing there at the end of the first half, gives it back to A&M. A&M drives down the field so fast, Florida even had time to screw up the clock again because A&M scored so fast. The only reason Florida's in the game is because their offense was going up up and down the field. Anthony Richardson had the long 65-yard run where it looked like he was barely jogging. He was just racing by people, certainly putting touchdowns on the board when they got down into the red zone. And then, it just completely flipped. They surrendered 2.1 yards per play in the third quarter, 3.3 yards per play in the fourth quarter, after surrendering 9.3 in the first half. Like that doesn't happen, right? You don't go from we can't stop anybody to all of a sudden the opponent can't do anything against us. And there were some adjustments that they made, and we'll talk about it. But the big thing is that they finally made Haynes King beat them. And when he was forced to do that, he just wasn't able to do it. He had 26 attempts for 95 yards in the second half, and he was sacked twice for 12 yards, for minus 12 yards. His yards above replacement was negative 4.6 in the second half after being 1.77 in the first half because he was 19 attempts for 184 yards. King was the key. They managed to stop him, and that first half was like the anomaly for Jimbo Fisher all year long. And, it was like Cinderella turned into a pumpkin at halftime and came back out. And it was the old A&M offense back. But, and I think we sort of thought that. And then you got the South Carolina game that comes and go, well, geez, maybe they have turned a corner. Maybe it does make a difference. And, we'll see. I mean, I don't think this is a great defense, but I think certainly it's no longer the worst defense in the SEC. And, I think they got used to Brenton Cox being out. And I think they got tougher against the run. Like I said earlier, 3 of 5 on third down in the first half, but they finished 4 of 13. So they finished 1 of 8 on third down in the second half. And, look, you get the team off the field like that repeatedly, and, you're going to have a lot of success.
So we took a couple of friends to the South Carolina game, a couple of Buckeyes who had never seen the Swamp. They had a great time. Thought it was awesome. But they were kind of asking about our season as we were walking up to the stadium. They're trying to feel out what to expect and everything. If you break down who we've actually lost to, Will, we've lost to Tennessee, probably going to make the playoff, should make the playoff. Georgia, probably going to make the playoff. And you lost to LSU, SEC championship game. And Kentucky, which that one we're still not. I got nothing for that. But 3 out of your 4 losses are to top 10 teams right now, and LSU is playing as good a football as anybody in the country right now. So I think if you look at the resume overall, I know 4 losses sucks. We're not thrilled with 4 losses at this time of year, but we didn't blow it to a lot of bad teams. We are winning the games you would think we should win, maybe outside of Kentucky there.
Well, but I mean, that Utah game is one that you look at and say, okay, and it's a top 10 team right now too, right? I think they're like 11th or 12th.
Yeah, they play Oregon this weekend. If they win, they're in the Pac-12 title game again.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, a very solid team. I don't know that they're as good as the other teams that Florida's lost to. I think probably not. I think if you put LSU and Utah on a neutral field, most of us would pick LSU. At the same time, look, Florida beat them legitimately. That was a clean game. And I think that's the difference. Like, you can point to a lot of different things, and certainly the defense is a big part of it. But here's the big part is that for the first 5 games, Anthony Richardson turned the ball over 8 times. They averaged 23.4 points per game in those first 5 games. And that includes 0 turnovers against Utah. So they scored 29 points in the game against Utah. Richardson doesn't turn the ball over. Montrell Johnson does on the fumble. And they probably score more than that if Johnson doesn't turn that ball over. The last 4 games, Richardson has 0 turnovers. They're averaging 33.5 points a game. That's the difference. The difference is Florida is not a turnover machine right now. And when the Gators aren't turning the ball over, they're going to score 34, 35, 36 points a game. You score 36 points a game, even if your defense is bad, you're going to have an opportunity to win. Now, the last couple of games or the last 6 quarters, the defense has been much, much better. And if you've got a defense playing like that, well, now you're going to have an opportunity to win games against quality opponents. So again, you go back to that schedule. I think Utah's better than Florida State. I think the 3 teams that Florida's lost to are better than Florida State. And so you look at the schedule and who's remaining. It's legitimate that Florida can get to 8-4. Now they still got work to do. They still got to do it. But, I think things are trending in the right direction. And certainly I don't think we're going to lose confidence against Vanderbilt. So going into that Friday game against Florida State, I think we're going to feel pretty good about it. Florida State, from an advanced metrics perspective, I think is a better team. But again, it's sort of what I thought you were going to say when you said we were walking into the stadium and I was trying to tell them what to do or what to expect, that you were just going to say, take the over. that this is going to be an entertaining game. There's going to be a
Oh,
lot of
I
points scored.
I
Take
also
the
said
over.
that. I thought this was going to be a good game. I thought this was going to be a hard fought game with South Carolina
Well,
for
not
sure.
only a good game, but a high scoring one, right?
Yeah.
That it was good. That it was going to be. I think I had 30-26 was the score that I picked, and I kind of expected it to be something where South Carolina maybe scored a touchdown late to bring it close and was onside kicking to try to get it back or something like that. And that Florida might be able to handle them, but I didn't think Florida was a 9-point favorite. I didn't think they were that much better than South Carolina. South Carolina had a better record. The advanced metrics kind of said they were very similar teams, and Florida made them look pedestrian. And I think that's a credit to Florida.
Right. And you did have the slew of turnovers there in the second half, which definitely helped. But even before that, it was just shut down defense.
Well,
It
the
was great.
turnovers would have put the game away. That's the
Yeah.
complaint I think you have beyond the special teams. That's the complaint that you have is you get
Yeah.
those 3 fumbles in South Carolina territory. You put those 3 into the end zone, you're putting up 50.
Right.
And people are looking at that going, whoa, like you just put everything together. Instead, they coasted on it in the third quarter and the fourth quarter, which I mean,
A little
whatever,
bit.
it's
Yeah.
okay. But they coasted on it and that's been the hallmark of this team is that they're consistently inconsistent. This was not a 4-quarter game. They dominated the first quarter. And it just basically put the game away. The hole was so big that by the time South Carolina sacrificed 3 straight drives there in the third quarter, it was over. And you're not going to get that every time. They're going to have to figure out how to put together 4 straight quarters of effectiveness. And but I see the same problem with my little league team. Like I can get them to play 2 good innings. I can't get them to play 7 good innings half the time. They don't have the attention span. And there's something to be said for young kids, new systems, and just in general, it's hard to get guys to concentrate for 4 quarters. And that is Napier's task, though. Napier's task is converting it from, hey, you can do this right once in the first quarter to do it right every time, 4 straight quarters, 3 hours, and then let's go home with a 50-point win.
So significant change that I've seen the last few weeks, and really you can trace it back to that second half against Georgia. Richardson has just been, it's seemingly much more aggressive running the football well. And that's helped, I believe, pour gasoline onto what was already a pretty explosive running game with Montrell Johnson and Trevor Etienne. And to Napier's credit, go look at the rotation the first few games. We're even saying it too, right? More 2, more 7. We want to see more of those guys, and we want to see Richardson run it more. They've slowly gotten to that point throughout the season. It's gotten more and more that way, and the offense has just gotten better and better. And really unleashing Richardson has been a key difference the last few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at Florida's 4 highest point totals, they correlate with Richardson's 4 highest rushing totals, except for the Utah game. He had 106 yards rushing in that one and only 29 points. Every other time they've gotten above 30 points when he's rushed for more than 62 yards. And therein lies the thing is that he's not a very good passing quarterback. And I think it's crazy that people are talking about him in the first round of the NFL draft. I think he goes if that's where he's going to end up. But I think it's nuts considering he's got a QB rating of 119 right now overall, 9 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. But the thing is that he's averaging 6.1 yards per rush. And if you look at him over the last 4 games, he's the exact same passer, except he hasn't thrown an interception. But rushing wise, he's averaged 6.1 for the entire season. He's averaged 7.2 over the last 4 games. So to your point, they are not only and 10 rushes a game as well. So they're not only he's more effective when he's running, but they're also giving him more shots. And that's part of it. I mean, that was one of the problems with Dan Mullen's usage of him last year is you bring him in, you let him rush twice. Oh, he gets tackled behind the line of scrimmage. We're not going to go back to that the rest of the game. Well, that's stupid. You got to give him 5, 6, 7 shots, and one of them is going to be a big time run. And so you give him 10 in a game, you're going to get 1 or 2 that are game changing. And, I said coming into the game, and it turns out it was the exact thing that happened, that South Carolina, if you look at Richardson through the air, he wound up with a QB rating of 117.4. Rattler through the air, QB rating of 116.1. They were the exact same quarterback, except Richardson had 15 rushes for 96 yards and Rattler had 6 for minus 13. Like that is the difference between the two of them. Now Rattler padded his stats a little bit towards the end as well, had about 30 or 40 yards at the end, but it's not going to change the ratings that much. Basically, you got the exact same quarterback, except Anthony Richardson can run the ball. And yeah, that is a place where Florida has a major advantage and they should take advantage of it.
That's also encouraging to see because we saw against Kentucky earlier in the year where he was a little bit off in the passing game or a lot off in the passing game against Kentucky. And it really rattled him. and he didn't adjust, and there wasn't that backup plan to go, hey, well, at least do it with your legs. I feel like with the South Carolina performance here, it's showing the growth and development that you want to see out of the quarterback. And you're right. I absolutely don't think he's ready for the NFL this year. I think this game's a great example as to why you should come back, where it's like, hey, yeah, the score looks good. The team's run the ball real well, but the accuracy was just not there. And he had some throws too. He had Pearsall on a couple. Poor Ricky Pearsall was open on a couple. It's just things are going behind him. They're going every which way. And come back, work on that a little bit over the summer, work on your footwork, kind of get steady. I feel like there's times where Richardson gets choppy and he just gets excited and he just lets it go a little quick. And I think instead of setting up and being a little more patient, but that comes with experience. Again, we're still in the first full year of Anthony Richardson starting. What is this, his 11th start, 12th start overall? That comes with experience. So I think it'd be perfect for him to work on that with Napier and company during the offseason, come back another year and really this offense, it's getting better and better. I can't wait to see that next year if Richardson comes back.
Yeah. All that being said, if somebody offers him first round money, you got to go.
Yeah, first round.
So,
I don't know if I see that though.
Oh no, a lot of people looking at it and going, look, Josh Allen wasn't accurate. Look at him. Now,
right. He came back for his senior year, did he not?
Yeah, well, he was also a Wyoming. And as a Bills fan, Allen's not in my good graces right now. So because he can't catch a snap. But stupid Vikings.
Oh man, so sorry for a couple of losses this year. Well, jeez, be a Jags fan, okay?
At least if you're a Jags fan, you have no hope. Buffalo always gives you hope and it kicks you around the balls.
We got a little hope now. It's a little better. That's my typical Jags jokes. It's a little better this year. All right,
sure.
Let's move on to 4 bits. Defensive turnaround. Will, you did a great job of highlighting it. The changes at halftime against Texas A&M. Your post game article last week. Can you walk us through the changes you felt Tony made?
Yeah, so it was pretty clear that they wanted Haynes King to beat him outside because he didn't have the arm strength to beat him outside. And A&M knew that too. And so typically when you want somebody to beat you outside, what you do is you put one safety in the middle of the field, and that one safety in the middle of the field tells the quarterback the middle of the field is closed. And so if you're very baseline, first thing you teach a quarterback when he comes out there is look at the safeties. If there's one out there in the middle of the field, the middle of the field is closed, throw outside. A&M did some stuff in the first half where what they were doing was they were essentially running 2 guys at that safety, making him choose, and then whichever guy he chose, Haynes King threw to the other guy. And there was a perfect third down example where they ran double posts basically, and King hit the back guy on the post who was in one-on-one coverage against an outside receiver or against an outside corner who's supposed to try to force him to the outside or to the inside, right? You want to force him into that safety, but that wasn't working because they were running off the safety. So what Florida did was they put 2 safeties out, which again typically means middle of the field is open. But then what they did was they had their guys shade to the inside. So the linebackers, the corners, the star, all those guys shaded to the inside of the receivers. And so the receivers had a choice. They could either go to the middle of the field, but you essentially had one-on-one coverage with 2 deep safeties, or you could go to the outside because they were shading you to the inside. And that's what they did. So if you look at the chart, the throw chart for Haynes King, I guarantee you there were a lot of throws down the middle of the tight end, down the middle to, where they had double post, throwing the ball to the area he wanted to throw to, where it was a short throw, he could be accurate, and his arm strength was able to get it there. The minute they made him throw to the outside, it was over. And they made him throw to the outside by basically saying, we're going to make the middle of the field look like it's open, but we're going to close it off underneath in terms of the leverage that we're playing on your receivers. And they were just never able to adjust. When they went downfield, Florida was able to stay with their guys. And when they went outside, they might beat Florida's guy who was on a one-on-one, but King couldn't make the throw. And so that's not a coverage that you can run against a guy like Hendon Hooker. And it's kind of a coverage I would have liked to have seen him run against Stetson Bennett, because I do think Bennett might have struggled with it. But a guy like Hooker is going to pick that apart. You can't run the same thing time after time after time. But King's a young guy. A&M's offense, not very good. Their receivers making sight adjustments against a coverage that they haven't seen before. It really threw them for a loop. And then A-Chain couldn't get going in the second half either. I already mentioned the fact that they couldn't run the ball. They started off that game with a 65-yard run to A-Chain where, he reverses field, runs around, and all of a sudden, oh, God, here we go again. And it's 7-7 right like that, where A&M drives right back down the field. In the second half, they were able to stop the run, make Haynes King throw outside. And the other thing that does is because he's throwing outside, it takes an extra tick to get rid of the ball. And all of a sudden, Princely Umanmielen and Antoine Power Island started getting some pressure. They started beating guys one-on-one. And the minute they started beating guys one-on-one and got in King's face, he was a little bit, or really significantly more inaccurate than he was in the first half. So you did that two ways, right? You made him make longer throws. You made him wait for the read that got pressure to him, and then that was able to sort of stop things. Against South Carolina, it was just they got pressure. I mean, if you go back and you look at that, Desmond Watson dominated up front, McClellan dominated up front, Power Island dominated up front, Umanmielen dominated up front. You very rarely heard that Ventrell Miller was hitting the quarterback, right? And the reason is they didn't have to blitz anybody. They just said, our front four is better than your front five. We're going to win. We're going to knock down Spencer Rattler. We don't think he's good enough to actually do this. Now, they did the simulated pressures and all those sorts of things and stuff like that. But when you look at the actual sacks, it was Jervon Dexter getting a sack. It was Umanmielen getting a sack. It was Power Island getting a sack. The defensive line is starting to get push in ways that it hasn't all year long. And that push impacts both the running game, but then it also impacts the passing game significantly as well. So a little bit of a coverage adjustment. Not a major one, other than the fact that I think it probably confused King a little bit. And then the other thing is that that they have just decided that their identity is that they're going to have that front four and they're going to win. And you couldn't say that before, but they are bringing four guys and the four defensive linemen much more often than they have previously. There was a lot of defensive linemen dropping into coverage all year long. There was a lot less of that in the second half against A&M and in the game against South Carolina. Doesn't mean it's not there. There was just less of it, and they won a bunch of battles up front.
I like hearing that. Developing some sort of identity. You gotta be good at something at least, right? Like you can't be not good at anything, which is what we're doing for the majority of the first part of the season there, Will. Hey, listen, I'm impressed with the secondary too. They've been tackling. I feel like they've been tackling much better the last couple games here. I mean, starting the second half of A&M there, but they are making some good tackles in the open field as well. What other signs of progress have you seen from this defense in the last couple of weeks?
I mean, the linebackers have played a lot better, right? I mean, think about Amari Burney, think about Shamar James is starting to get, I think he's starting to get it a little bit. He's probably their most physically gifted guy. And then Ventrell Miller, there was a play where Power Island sort of squeezed on a read or it could have been a read option, right? It's Rattler has the ability to hold it. So Rattler play actions and goes out into the flat. And typically what you would see is Power Island chase after Rattler, and then Miller would have to cover the running back in the flat. But because of their alignment, because of the way they were set up, that wasn't going to work. So what they did was Power Island actually takes the running back out of the backfield, and Miller went to the quarterback. And Miller gets the pressure on Rattler. Rattler throws an incomplete pass. But the fact that they were able to pass off those guys and do the coverage correctly, almost. I think Trey Dean was probably supposed to stay back on a tight end who wound up open across the middle. But the tight end was open, but Rattler couldn't hit him because Power Island and Ventrell Miller switched off whose responsibilities were who's on that play. So that's the big thing, is the communication, understanding your responsibilities, covering for the fact that Ventrell Miller is not physically gifted enough to get out there on the running back consistently, especially if he's aligned inside a little bit to help stop the run. So knowing what your responsibility is and not crashing, not taking your instinct and saying, I'm going to go after the quarterback, but say, no, my responsibility is the running back. I'm going to get out there. Those are the types of plays they haven't made previously, right? That would have been one that, again, it's not just Cox, but that's one where Cox would have gone after the quarterback. You would have had a running back open, would have gotten dumped off the running back. Ventrell Miller would have been run to the outside. It would have been 8, 9, 10 yards before he was able to get to him, just because that's sort of the way that defensive alignment sits. So that's the thing that I think I've seen more than anything, is these guys are trusting each other much more than they were previously, that the other guy is going to be in the right position. And so you don't have to make the play by yourself. You can force the guy back towards the middle. You can trust that if you fill your gap, you don't have to worry about the other gap. And look, there's still going to be some big plays. I mean, there was a 3rd and 17 that got converted on the second drive. But unlike previously, where a 3rd and 17 got converted and the whole defense fell apart, they immediately stopped them. Three straight plays. And that sort of thing is obviously encouraging. And look, I mean, we're sort of looking for needles and haystacks here when we're looking for positivity. The defense has flipped a switch over the last 6 quarters. So this isn't like, well, they were giving up 9 yards of play and now they're giving up 7. It's like, no, they were giving up 9 yards of play. Now they're giving up 3. And so that's a distinct change. And there's been a lot that's changed, but I think confidence is a big part of it. And certainly I think they're riding high heading into this game against Vanderbilt.
Well, I know Napier said that kicking Cox off the team, it wasn't just about one thing. It was a cumulative effect there. However, you mentioned it, the trust that these guys have in each other. It seems to not just be that Cox is out of position on a play or something, but that it's just the overall message to the unit seems to have sunk in a little more in these last couple of weeks. I mean, don't get me wrong, you still got that first half of A&M on tape. You still got that. That was post Cox too. So it's not all we got rid of Cox and everything was solved overnight. But to your point there, how much of that decision to remove one of your most talented players off the roster for what seems to be philosophical differences, how much of that has had an impact on the turnaround of this defense?
I mean, it's hard to tell. Like you said, the first half against A&M, we went well. Apparently, Brenton Cox wasn't the problem, and by the time we got done with the South Carolina game, I think I was messaging you. Now I definitely want New England to draft Brenton Cox. So, I don't think it was all him. I don't, but I do think that taking what we would have at the time termed, described as the most physically gifted player on the defense and saying, look, we'll do it without you. Like, we don't need you here.
Yeah, it's more the messaging than Cox himself. That's what I'm saying.
It's we don't need you here to be this bad. Like, we can be this bad without you. And then there's no more excuses. There's no like, well, we're treating Cox differently. There's no like, well, he's gotten away with things, so you're going to go over there and pout. There's none of that stuff. It's, look, he's not here anymore. If Antoine Powell-Ryland, you can't say you're not getting playing time anymore. If that edge isn't set and if you're not getting pressure on the quarterback, it's on you now, dude. It's on you now, dude. And same thing with Human Mealan, right? If you're not getting to the quarterback, if you're not making game-changing plays, it's on you. And, I think in some ways that the freeing of saying we're not going to rely on Brenton Cox to use his physical gifts to an advantage. We're going to rely on doing our job within the scheme because we can't afford to freelance. We're not talented enough to do that. And so we're going to do this. And look, I think I don't know what was said. Napier said that he was impressed by the leadership shown in the locker room at halftime of Texas A&M, but God, they had to be getting tired of getting embarrassed. And so in some ways you sit there and you go, look, you're not doing the job. If you don't want to do it, then get off the field. And I think in some ways the dismissal of Cox allows you to set that precedent because, he was one of the guys with a lot of time invested in the defense. So he's going to be one of the leaders. And, we saw Ventrell Miller sort of berate everybody on the sidelines against LSU, and that didn't get the job done. So, something else was needed. Again, I think this is one of those things where you say, look, Brent Cox is a really good player, but his fit with Billy Napier and with Patrick Toney clearly was not great. His stats were down. He was struggling generally overall. He was still having some of the problems we've seen in his career at Florida, though they were exacerbated because you weren't getting big plays from him time after time. And so, again, I think this is one of those things where in a perfect world, had he been recruited by Patrick Toney, I think Brenton Cox probably plays very, very well in this scheme. But sometimes it's just a square peg in a round hole, not necessarily because of fit, but because Brenton Cox wasn't recruited by Billy Napier. He wasn't recruited by Patrick Toney. He's looking to the NFL and he's sitting there going, these guys aren't putting me in a position to use my skills, to show my skills for the NFL. And then you start pressing and then you start doing things that are not within the scheme because you want to show people what you can do. And look, I think what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is that just doing your job has immense value when you have pretty decent talent on the defensive side of the ball. And I think that's a big part of what we've seen.
Well, it's a fascinating storyline with the defense, completely unexpected. And let's hope it continues. Let's hope it continues. Yeah, I've definitely enjoyed watching it. Definitely enjoyed it. All right, let's move on to 6 bits here. Last Wednesday night, Hugh Hathcock of the Gator Guard proclaimed on Twitter, tomorrow will be a great day, Gator fans. And then a little time went by, and then everyone had dinner, and then everyone, like, flipped on a show after dinner, and then they checked Twitter again, and he was probably getting blown up a little bit. So there's a little bit of a, hey, just a little longer, guys, just a little longer. Well, it turns out the news was coming from the West Coast, Will. So it was a little late to develop, but Thursday night, highly touted quarterback Jaden Rashada announced that he would be flipping his commitment from the Miami Hurricanes to the Florida Gators. This was one of those head-to-head battles that Florida has lost to Miami, one of several over the past recruiting cycle. So it was not only sweet to flip a Miami commit, but sweet to pick up, what looks to be your quarterback of the future here, Will. So how big is this for Billy Napier's staff, and how much of a tone does this set for the recruiting class going forward?
I mean, it's big from the standpoint of he's the highest rated recruit they have on the board, and it's clearly at the most important position in all of football, right? So you look, I Marcus Stokes is a good player, but he's not the guy that you look at and say this is a guy who's going to lead Florida to prominence, at least not a surefire thing. And in the article I sort of detail whether Rashada is a surefire thing. He's not. He's probably a 1 in 4 shot that he turns into an elite quarterback. I mean, look, if you look at Florida's history, Felipe Franks was ranked 54th overall, and Rashada's 57th right now in the 24/7 rankings. Emory Jones was ranked 85th overall. So, and Matt Corral though was 63rd, right? Tua was 32nd. Jake Fromm was 44th. So there are CJ Stroud 42nd. Drew Lock was 98th. Jake Browning was 73rd. But again, Jarrett Guarantano 79th, right? So there are certainly guys who are busts at this ranking, and there are guys who are successes at this ranking. The point of the article was saying that you get 4 shots to get a quarterback, right? Because you got a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. You got 4 shots to get them. And this is the second class now that Napier's had. Now, Napier came into a situation where he had Anthony Richardson. Most guys who come into a situation where the previous coaches got fired don't have a guy who's a dark horse Heisman candidate on the roster that they can sit there and go, this guy has NFL level skill and I just need to develop him. So Napier maybe gets bought a little bit of time, especially if Richardson comes back next year. But the reality is you got to have a quarterback in the hopper every year. And so Rashada this year, they're going heavy after DJ Lagway the year after. They're going to need another guy in that category the year after. And what's going to happen is if you can piece those together, one after another, you're going to hit at the quarterback at some point. It was interesting on Gators Breakdown last night. Gator Dave was listing like all the quarterbacks that Florida's had. And he was getting down to Richardson and Jacoby Brissett and, guys in that range, like at like 14 or 15 in terms of the best signing for Florida from a ranking perspective since 2000. So over a 22-year period, you're down in like the 150s, 160s, 170s overall rankings at year 14 or 15. What does that say? Well, no wonder we've had instability at the quarterback position, right? We hit big on guys like Chris Leak and guys like Tim Tebow. But then beyond that, you're buying lottery tickets that are like a 1 in 4 shot. And Jeff Driscoll didn't work out, and Jacoby Brissett didn't work out, at least not at Florida. And Will Grier got popped for steroids. And so you have all these different things happening with these big time quarterbacks who are he actually did get popped for it, whether he took it or not, and whether he took it intentionally is allegedly. But it was a
just feels like a statement you say allegedly after.
Maybe. So the point is that I don't know, and you don't know whether Rashada is going to be an awesome quarterback or whether he's going to be a bust. But what we do know is that if you don't sign a quarterback of Rashada's ilk in every single class, you're doomed to be either boom or bust in terms of quarterbacks. And, people throw the Clemson recruiting model in our face all the time, or my face all the time, when I'm talking about needing to have elite recruiting. And there are a bunch of things wrong with throwing Clemson in my face. But the big thing is that Taj Boyd, Deshaun Watson, and Trevor Lawrence were the quarterbacks there for for 11 of the 13 years where Clemson was riding high. And those are elite quarterback prospects who hit. And I think, you look at a guy like Hunter Johnson, though, was somebody who went in who went in there and, 2017 is the 30th ranked overall player. He's a 5-star guy. He winds up like transferring out of Clemson because he can't beat out, I think it was Deshaun Watson, must have been Trevor Lawrence. And then he transfers back to Clemson.
He's back there, right? Yeah.
He is.
He's like a coach. He's like / coach, I think.
Yeah, but you look at him, he's got 211 total attempts in his career, averaging 5.2 yards per attempt, 56% completions
Well,
for his college career.
That's Northwestern offense for you.
Wow. Again, so my point is not that Clemson did not just hit on Deshaun Watson and Taj Boyd and Trevor Lawrence. They have constantly been signing high-level quarterback prospects, and those are the three who hit. And so Jaden Rashada is one of those things for Billy Napier. He is a lottery ticket with about a 25% shot at being the next elite quarterback for the Florida Gators. And you have to have one of those in every class. That's why this is a big deal, not just because of Rashada, not just because of the flip from Miami. All those things are important too, not just because he's the highest recruit in the class, but because if you bring in 4 guys ranked in the top 60 in the next 4 classes, I guarantee you Florida's going to have a guy competing for the Heisman Trophy at some point in those next 4 years.
Kind of nice to stick it to Miami too.
I mean,
especially after the Cormani deal, especially after that. It also goes to show you signing day is not here yet. He got till December. So all these commitments are great and all, but they're just verbal commitments for the near future. But we'll see how things go. Been a lot of rumors, a lot of excitement around the program about potentially other flips to come. But it does seem like Billy Napier and his staff, they sat back and now they're ready to strike and pounce on a few more potential guys that maybe thought to be going elsewhere right now. Will.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think if you look at value charts in the NFL, that's a great place to look at. So quarterbacks make 36, the top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL make $36 million a year. Edge rushers make 22, wide receivers make 19, left tackles make 18, interior defensive lines make 18, cornerbacks make 17. So 36 million for the quarterback, 17 for the cornerback. And so in terms of valuation, you talk about Cormani McClain. I think Cormani McClain's a can't miss prospect. Without Rashad on the board, without a big time quarterback on the board, he's probably worth whatever NIL capital you have to spend to bring him in. At the same time, if you asked me which one's more important, which one brings more value to the program, I think Rashada brings more value, right? He's the quarterback. He's the guy who gets paid, in the NFL, $36 million if he's a top 10 versus a cornerback who gets paid 17 million. So that's the first part of it. And then the second part of it is that none of us know what's going to happen with NIL, but this is throwing a wrinkle in everything, right? Is that there are guys who have committed to deals we know, right? I mean, there was the Athletic report that showed the contract that everyone suspects is for Iamaliva up at Tennessee. We've seen those contracts, and those contracts, yes, they exist, and but we don't know whether these guys who've committed have actually signed the contracts, right? And so if somebody comes in and says, "Hey, I'll make you a better offer," like they'd be stupid not to listen to it. And Napier has made a lot of comments about NIL being a part of bringing somebody to Florida, and so building a relationship that has more to do with than just, can I get this NIL deal? What's the best NIL deal I can get? Now, look, I think in many cases, you're going to lose battles if you say we're not going to match. But I do think that in many cases, if the NIL deals are equivalent and you have a better relationship with Napier, then that's where you're going to end up. And so, I think that might be a big part of it, right? Is that you committed to Miami because you got the deal you wanted. And then you looked at it, you said, well, I actually kind of like that Napier guy better. Let me go back and see if he'll give me the same deal that I got here, and then you can flip people.
Or maybe you're trying to watch your new team on television, and they're constantly on ESPN Plus at 12:30.
I mean, there's nothing better than watching your team get beat by 38 points on the Ocho, man. Come on.
Yeah, the ACC, you got to do a little better by your teams there, man. A lot of ESPN Plus action there.
All right. I mean, look, if the guy wants to win an ACC championship, he's got a better shot at Florida than he does at Miami. So.
All right, 2 more entrants here in the transfer portal. Will Trent Whittemore, wide receiver who was very active in the Dan Mullen era, had some injuries, but definitely a guy that had a lot of potential. I was very excited to see how Whittemore would progress coming into this year, and I absolutely thought he'd be in the mix of a steady receiver for the Gators this year. Haven't seen much of him on the field, and tight end Nick Elksnis both have announced their intent to enter the transfer portal. Look, we didn't get to see much of Elksnis. I believe he's out of Jacksonville, but young guy committed to the Mullen staff as well. I expect to see many. I'm not going to say many, but several more names in the recent next upcoming weeks here entering the transfer portal.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think for Elksness, he hasn't been on the field all year, and you think about where he is on in the pecking order. You had Zipper, then you had Zanders. Now you've got Jonathan Odom, who's starting to do some stuff at tight end, and so Elksness looks at that, and you got Boardingham, and you got a bunch of other guys who are going to come in at
Mm-hmm.
tight end that Napier's recruited. Look, he's reading the tea leaves just like Whittemore is, which is that the young guys, the Napier guys are going to surpass some of these older guys as they get experience. That bringing in a guy like Douglas, like Caleb Douglas, and
Nice
having him
game
start day
too.
one.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
But my point is, having him start day one, probably not possible. Whittemore probably had an opportunity to beat him out. But now that Caleb Douglas has, 6, 7, 8 games under his belt and has gone out and proven that he can be a valuable contributor. Well, now Whittemore looks at it and goes, well, I'm behind him. He fell behind Jaquavian Frazier's. He's been behind Henderson and Shorter and some other guys as well. Marcus Burke's been out there a little bit.
Yep.
Shakow Bowman's been out there. So, look, I think Whittemore looked at it and said, look, this just isn't what I signed up for, right? Like I signed up for the seniority. I signed up for the fact that the hard work that I put in the last 2 years is going to get me on the field. And reality is that's not what's happening. Is that the guys who are able to pick up the scheme and the guys who are able to contribute are the guys who are being thrown out there. And look, the writing was on the wall when his brother decided to decommit and commit to Mississippi State. And again, I think it's the same thing I said with Cox, is that these guys were thrust into a forced marriage. And the reality is that we knew all along the way that some of these forced marriages weren't going to work just because the staff didn't recruit them and they weren't going to get the playing time. And the things that Dan Mullen wants his receivers to do is different than the things that Billy Napier wants his receivers to do. So even in that way, it's not necessarily the best fit in the world in terms of offense and those sorts of things. So look, I think Whittemore's going to get a fresh start someplace else. He's got 2 years of eligibility left. Elksness, I think, probably has 3, maybe even 4 if he takes a medical red shirt. So these guys are going to be in college for a little while. They're going to have an opportunity to contribute somewhere. Wish him the best, because the reality is we're getting Napier players in instead of those guys, and it'll be up to those guys to succeed. I think one of the things that's maybe overlooked about the Dan Mullen era is that the 2020 team that goes 8-4 and really did have an opportunity to win a title was just absolutely chock full of Jim McElwain recruits. Like those weren't Dan Mullen guys who came in and took over and were pushing. Kyle Trask was a Jim McElwain recruit. Kadarius Toney was a Jim McElwain recruit. Kyle Pitts was a McElwain commit who then stayed with the program, right? Shorter was somebody who came in and was a transfer. Rick Wells was a McElwain recruit. Trevon Grimes again was a transfer. Jacob Copeland was sort of again one of those guys who was sort of considering Florida and then decided to stay with Dan Mullen. You got Ventrell Miller still with the team, but he was a recruit. He was a McElwain recruit. You got Brad Stewart, a McElwain recruit. You got Zach Carter, who I believe was a McElwain recruit. So you just start going down the list, and the guys who were on that defense, the guys who were really significant contributors, the guys even on the offensive side of the ball were McElwain recruits. And 3 years in, that's not healthy. You don't want to be at a place where you're doing that. Now we enjoyed the ride because Kyle Trask was playing so well, but one of the reasons the defense was so poor is that they had not reinforced that defense with guys who could come in and contribute at a really, really high level. And that's just the reality of it. So, I mean, geez, you look back at that 2019 bump class for Mullen, and it's just awful. The only guy who really has been a significant contributor to an NFL level is Kyrie Elam. And you look at Chris Steele, who was supposed to be the gem of that class, and he ends up being an undrafted free agent, even though he never plays at Florida. So that class really had some issues. Mullen wasn't able to replace those guys. So the guys we're seeing leaving the program, I think that's healthy if they're getting beat out by Napier guys, because that's what you want to see. You want to see rapid turnover. You want to see those guys start to excel. And look, are they going to be good enough to take over Tennessee and Alabama and Kentucky and the teams that Napier's lost to this year? We don't know, but we won't be relying on Dan Mullen guys to do that 3 years from now. And I think that's a healthy thing.
That's a good point. Let's move on here to a dollar. Talk about the SEC championship game first. LSU clinches the West with a win over Arkansas. Tight game, Will. Ugly offensive. Not a lot of offense there in that one. 13-10, I believe the Tigers win. And Georgia steamrolls Mississippi State in the second half, clinches the East. But I think the storyline of the season here is Brian Kelly and this LSU team. Georgia's exactly where a lot of people expected them to be. They're on a roll. I don't foresee an issue with LSU in Atlanta. I know LSU stepped up, beat Georgia. I know they're playing some good football right now. Or I'm sorry, they beat Alabama. Know they're playing some good football right now. But regardless of the performance in Atlanta, Will, the fact that Brian Kelly won the West his first year with LSU, unbelievable job out in Baton Rouge.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think obviously anytime you beat Alabama in this SEC, that's a big deal, right? And you sort of looked at it in the 21-17 win over Auburn, not all that impressive. The 23-24 loss to Florida State, where you missed the extra point, obviously that's a rough one. They got absolutely boat raced by Tennessee, beat Florida by 10. And then, they've stepped up since then, but the Alabama game's a 1-score win. The Arkansas game's a 1-score win. You start looking at that, typically, 1-score victories don't bode well. And they're 3-1 now in 1-score games. And so it's entirely conceivable that they could be right where Florida is with a little bit worse luck. Right. And that's kind of what we're looking at here is that game against Alabama. I think, look, Alabama's a good team. They're not a great team this year, which is weird because I thought they were going to be really, really good coming into this year, coming off of last year. They just have not been able to turn it on.
How many games have they escaped? Texas, Ole Miss this weekend. I mean, they're being tested week in and week out.
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, they've come back to the pack a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is going to be, has Georgia come back to the pack as well? Or are they just going to steamroll LSU? So I look at this, and again, I don't know. I don't think it's fair to judge coaches on the first year when they come in terms of success. And the reason why is that it's the previous regime's players. And so this will sound like I'm making an excuse. In some ways I am. But look, Brian Kelly has taken teams that have consistently, like a staff that consistently recruited at a very, very high level. Like you go look at Ed Orgeron's classes, they're sitting there 5, 6, 7 nationally overall. Every year he was there, except for one. They had 1 year where it dropped down because they just didn't sign very many players. But the quality of player at LSU is very, very high. And now they've got some stability at the head coach with a guy who, quite honestly, has taken less talent at Notre Dame and been able to win games. Jaden Daniels turns a corner in that game against Florida and has been a very, very good quarterback ever since. And yeah, they're winning some games. And I think that's
Brian
that's
Kelly recruit, by the way.
Yeah, well, that's a testament to Brian Kelly.
Yeah.
I mean, look, the other thing you got to say is Harold Perkins is the reason they won that game against Arkansas. And damn, it would have been really nice to have Harold Perkins against, Kentucky or Utah or Tennessee or Georgia. Like that guy is a difference maker.
Yep.
And when people sit there and go, well, this guy's a 3-star recruit, he was able to succeed. It's like, yeah, go look at Harold Perkins. Like that guy day one walked onto the field.
Another Kelly, like the best... another Kelly edition, right?
Absolutely. So look, I mean, Brian Kelly is going to be a problem and LSU is going to be a problem. And that is the reality. But the whole point of this, the whole point of bringing in Billy Napier is to make other programs go, Billy Napier is going to be a problem, right? And if he doesn't do that, then 3 years from now, we'll be trying to find the next Billy Napier who's going to be a problem. And if he does do that, then great, because we're going to have some awesome battles against LSU and Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee and these other teams that are sort of raising the level of playing the SEC. Look, I mean, it's been fun to be able to like lord over Tennessee for the last 2 decades. But it's actually good to have rivalries within the SEC where you're not just pounding the guy every year, where like you're climbing a mountain to beat someone and get over that hump. Like there's value in that. There's fun in that when you finally do get over the hump. It's like if you're playing video games, if you're just going to hit reset every time your team is behind so that you go 11-0 or 12-0 every time you're playing NCAA football, back when that game was available, like you can do it. But is that really fun, or is you're not getting better by doing that? You're just, you're just snowing yourself over and you're lying to yourself. So look, I think you look at the two teams, you say LSU's done a very nice job. They brought in supplemental pieces that have been able to help. They got a little bit fortunate in that Alabama is not the same juggernaut that they've been year over year, but they got the job done. And that's all you can say about them is they got the job done.
They've also massively improved as the season has gone along too, which is also a sign of good coaching. So I think big ups there to Brian Kelly there at LSU. That's a super impressive victory. Don't think the SEC title game is going to be as good as it could have been, but it's still impressive that LSU won the West. Let me ask you this though. I keep hearing this talk. Well, if LSU beats Georgia, they'll be the first 2-loss team in the playoff. Should they be? Because Georgia, that would be their first loss. And Tennessee went into Baton Rouge in October, just completely obliterated LSU. one-loss team only to Georgia as well. If Tennessee wins out, let's assume Tennessee and Georgia both win out as well, and those are their one losses. The one loss for Tennessee is to Georgia. The only Georgia loss would be to LSU. Does two-loss LSU really deserve the playoff spot in that situation?
I mean,
Over a Tennessee
you,
team that beat them like 40-13. I think they scored a touchdown late too.
yeah.
It
So
wasn't even close.
you're talking to somebody who does not like the idea of an expanded playoff, and who the reason is that I don't like the devaluing of the conference championship. And so if a team wins the hardest conference in the league, or the hardest conference in college football, and they do it irrespective of whether they lose two games. Look, I mean, the second loss is a one point loss to Florida State. Who did Georgia play? Well, Georgia played Oklahoma, or Georgia played Oregon. So you can make an argument that Georgia's got a non-conference, but Pitt, is that the non-conference game that Tennessee's going to hang its hat on? Right? If Pitt had played a Florida State, or if Tennessee had played Florida State to start the year, I still think they smoke them.
But what about the head-to-head?
Well, I mean, look, I get it. You didn't win your damn conference. And this is part of the problem with having 4 teams in a playoff. And eventually when we have 12 teams in a playoff, that you're going to sit there and you're going to go, well, why even have the conference championship game? You're actually at a disadvantage to have the conference championship game in many ways, right? Like if Georgia goes in and loses this game and happens to, for some reason, get left out of a playoff, and really that's what you're you're advocating for Georgia to lose the SEC championship game and then Georgia and Tennessee to be put in the playoff. Right, that's what you're saying. If LSU, at that point, why didn't Georgia just forfeit?
For the record, I wouldn't love it, but I just don't think it's as done of a deal as people are making it out to be. If you go back to, I want to say it was 2016, Penn State, they had lost 2 games. They beat Ohio State, so they won the East. They won the Big Ten title that year. They still put Ohio State in with one loss over a 2-loss Big Ten champion Penn State. That was that Rose Bowl where Penn State went out and played Sam Darnold and USC and had that great game. Saquon Barkley at Penn State. Look, I know LSU would be the SEC champions, but it would be hard to look at that and go, hey, Tennessee beat this team by 4 touchdowns almost, and you're going to put them in the playoff over them.
Well, what that does though is it completely resets the incentive structure for the entire conference, right? Because if you win the SEC championship game and you don't get into the playoff, then winning the SEC doesn't matter. Right. What it means is style points against Florida State matter. What it means is that
did Georgia win the SEC last year?
They did not, and I don't like that either. Like I thought it was, I understand it, but I don't like the fact that Alabama had to beat them twice in 3 weeks or twice in 6 weeks, whatever.
Well, Alabama's done that to other teams too.
Absolutely, I didn't like it then either.
LSU in a BCS.
I am consistent on this in that what I want to see in a playoff or a BCS is I want to see the SEC champion play other teams, because I think if you run the gauntlet of the SEC, and then you go play the Notre Dames and the Ohio States and the Clemsons of the world, for the most part, the SEC is going to come out on top. And the idea that you got to sit there and beat up another SEC team. And yes, Georgia and Alabama were by far the 2 best teams in the country last year. Like by that definition, they deserve to be in that Final Four. But I didn't find it all that interesting. I knew what was going to happen in those 2 games where Alabama was, I don't even remember who Alabama played, Clemson or Ohio, who'd they play? And then you had the Notre Dame or the Michigan versus Georgia game.
Oh, Alabama played Cincinnati.
Yeah, Alabama played Cincinnati. So I'm just sitting there going, it's basically tune-up games for the SEC championship again. And Alabama just won the SEC championship.
But is LSU one of the 2 best teams in the SEC this year?
No, I don't think so. But they made the championship game. Like
I know they're the best team. They won the West. They great.
So again, I go back to what is the purpose, and this is the problem with any sort of playoff is what is the purpose? Because let's be honest, when you go to a 12-team playoff, you're gonna have 8 SEC teams in it. So so what is the purpose of the playoff? If the purpose of the playoff is to identify the 4 best teams in the country, then let's go ahead and put LSU, Georgia, and Tennessee in if LSU wins, because those are 3 of the best 4 teams in the country. Now, people will yell about it, but let's go ahead and do it because that's what it is. Now, I don't think that's fair to LSU to say, hey, you just beat Georgia, go play them again. You beat Alabama 2 weeks ago, go play them again, right? Like the whole point is that if you're talking about, well, what happened on the field with Tennessee? Well, what happened on the field with Alabama? What happened on the field with Georgia? Like, to make them play those teams again in the playoff doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But look, if LSU beats Georgia, I think you can make an argument they beat Alabama and they beat Georgia, and they lost to Tennessee. Okay. And they lost to
By
Florida
a
State.
landslide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, again, I get it. I understand what you're saying. I just, look, why play the championship game then? Like, why bother? Like, at this point, they should just say, we're not going to play it. We've got an East champion, a West champion, and we're just going to take the two teams from the East because we think they're the best.
There's multiple precedents in the playoff era for a champion being passed over for a non-champion in the playoffs.
Yeah, I'm saying
I don't think it's an automatic. If LSU wins, I don't think it's an automatic.
I don't think so either. I'm just telling you, I don't think so
Yeah.
either. I'm just telling you, I think the precedent sucks. I think the SEC champion should be the one who goes to the playoff. And honestly, I don't think they should let the other team in. Now, that's probably unpopular for people who are SEC folks, but I just don't think that makes sense. I think value your championship. Otherwise, nobody cares, right? Like, I will care when Napier gets Florida back to the SEC championship game, whether they win. But if they get to that SEC championship game with 3 losses and then don't make the playoff if they win the game, am I going? Am I spending my money to go to that game to watch Florida win? Probably the first time. Second time, not at all. It doesn't matter anymore. Like, I don't care. I've surpassed that as the overall goal. It's not even like the SEC championship game when the BCS was around was pretty much the pathway to the national championship. So like in 2008, when Florida beats Alabama, they have to play them again 3 weeks later in this configuration. Like, that's exactly what would have happened is Florida would have gotten Alabama again 3 weeks later. I just don't think that's right. I don't think it's good. You beat them on the field in the championship game, you go. And you set those rules at the start, kind of like that ridiculous debacle they had in the Big 12 years ago, where they had the 3 teams, right? They had Texas, TCU, and Oklahoma. They were taking like the highest ranked team out of the 3 because they had like a round robin. Each of them had lost 1 game to each other, and they're sitting there going, "Well, who's the highest rated one? That's who we'll send to the BCS title game." And I understood why they did it that way, but if they'd actually played on the field and one of them had won the conference championship, that's the one I think you send. So, like, I get it. I understand the argument. I understand the precedent. I just don't like it. And I think if LSU wins, they deserve to go. And it doesn't really matter because Georgia's going to smoke them.
Well, that's why I think it won't be that controversial because I do think Georgia's going to smoke them too. However, LSU have been underestimated all year. Let's see if they can pull it off again. It will be interesting to watch.
Brian Kelly's just going to put him in a trance with a Southern accent. So.
Vanderbilt. Let's talk about the Commodores. Will, fresh off of a 24-21 last-minute upset over the mighty Kentucky Wildcats. I'll tell you what, that NFL quarterback they got up there in Lexington, Will, he near passed for over 100 yards. All right. That guy, man, take him. I can't wait to watch him play for the Houston Texans. I hope he seems like a Lovie Smith quarterback, man. Get him there in Houston. I love that fit.
Poor Dameon Pierce.
First SEC game. Good for Dameon Pierce because that'll be 25, 30 carries a game. You're going to get a nice contract. He's getting that already. So that's
he's going to have to retire in 3 years because he can't freaking walk because he's been hit so much.
I get that second contract, Pierce. Let's go. Killing it for my fantasy team too this year. I love it. First SEC win in the Clark Lee era. The SEC win was also the first for the Doors since beating Missouri on October 19th, 2019 in Nashville. First road win in the SEC since 2018 at Arkansas. So, well, this Vanderbilt program, we've talked about it. We make mention of them once in a while in the offseason about how we like the direction of where they're going, and they seem to be recruiting in a very creative manner. Even though they're 14th in the SEC, they're still better than a lot of the top teams in other conferences. 32nd nationally, I believe, last year. So seeing some progress from Vanderbilt off the field, but we haven't seen it translate into wins. And we haven't seen many of those wins this year, but they are 4-6. They did get that SEC upset there. Vandy, liking what they're doing this season, liking the direction they're going. Don't think they're there yet, though, to compete with the Gators on Saturday. And fully expect this Gators program, who is currently clicking, to go out and play a good game in Nashville. And, I don't think we're good enough to overlook anybody. Well, I know Florida State's around the corner, but, hopefully we stay focused and we go out there, and if we play like we did against South Carolina, I don't think there'll be a lot of trouble up in Nashville.
No, I mean, look, I think the first thing you say is for Clark Lee and Barton Simmons over there at Vanderbilt, that they are building something there. This team had won 5 games the 3 previous years, including one where they went 0-9 in 2010 when all they were playing was SEC teams. And to get What's that?
2020. Sorry.
2020, yeah, sorry. When they played all SEC teams, they went 0-9. So to get to 4-6, to get that first SEC win in, God, what, 28 tries, whatever it is, that's significant. But again, it's a one-score win. Those can go either way. Certainly, if that ball's incomplete from right at the end, that game's completely different. Everybody feels a lot different. Let's not forget they also lost to Missouri and South Carolina coming into the game against Kentucky. So it's not as though they'd like turn this ship around and we're taking on the dregs of the SEC and beating them. It's like, nah, they caught lightning in a bottle a little bit. Now, they did dominate Kentucky. They almost doubled them in terms of total yardage. The big difference there was Mike Wright. That Wright terrorized Kentucky. He had over 100 yards rushing. I think he had 200 yards passing in the game. He has been somebody who, from overall, he's averaging 7.0 yards per attempt, 9 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, a QB rating of 136. AJ Swan, the guy who Wright was benched for, has gone. He's averaged 6.6 yards per attempt on 181 attempts. The difference is Wright has 454 yards rushing, and Swan has negative 55. So by my metric, yards above replacement, Wright's actually above average. He's way above average, 1.05. Swan's negative 1.74. Now, Wright played very, very well against Hawaii to a point where he was like the best quarterback in the SEC for about 3 weeks, just because he lit up Hawaii.
Yeah.
And so, the numbers are a little bit misleading there, but what isn't misleading is that he's averaging 8 yards per rush and that he just lit up Kentucky on the ground. And that's the risk. So if you're asking me, what do you want to look for if you're Florida? Well, Florida stopped the run the last 6 quarters against A&M and baby USC. And that's what you're looking for if you're looking at what Florida has to do here. Vanderbilt, from the standpoint of just like on offense, they're not explosive at all. They only have 115 plays at 10 plus yards. Florida has 152 in the same number of games. They're about as consistent on offense as Florida is from a success rate perspective. So really what they are Florida's offense, and how frustrating Florida's offense can be without the explosives. So that's how bad they are. Again, already talked about Wright, but obviously he's been benched. It wasn't like he was hurt. He got benched, and I think that makes a difference. The other thing is Vandy's defense is worse than Florida. They've given up 25 plays of 30-plus yards, and Florida's only given up 15. So as bad as Florida's defense has been, Vandy's has been worse. They played better against Kentucky, but Florida actually played better against Kentucky than Vanderbilt did. You start looking at the overall metrics, Florida's still bad. They're still 112th in yards per play, but Vanderbilt's 124th. And then you look at yards per rush surrendered, Vanderbilt's 113th. Florida's 3rd on offense. So where's the mismatch? The mismatch is give it to 7, give it to 2, give it to 15, and give it to 21 if you need it. But give the ball to the running backs, let them eat, blow them off the line of scrimmage, and Florida should be able to win this one. Just because, look, the last couple of games you've mentioned that they've had Richardson, Etienne, and Montreal Johnson all up around 100 yards. If they do that again, they're going to dominate this game, and this is an opponent where they should be able to do that.
Not trying to put a damper in anything, because all those numbers sound great, Will. But what percentage of the time do you walk away from a Vanderbilt game and go, man, that was good? It just feels – it's a game that we tend to play down to, even no matter how good the team is, no matter the disparity between these two programs. It just feels like we'll have an ugly couple quarters and then maybe turn it on at some point. It seems to happen more frequently with Vanderbilt than other programs.
Well, I mean, look, last year, Florida, as bad as they were, beat Vanderbilt 42-0. Mm-hmm. So it's not as though we never had those
SEC win, right? With Mullen.
Oh God. It's just that you remember the 9-7s and you
being
remember
down 21-0.
Yeah. You remember all those things because you're not supposed to. And look, it's an 11 a.m. start local time up there in Nashville. Those are always a little bit interesting. It's not warm up here anymore, right? I mean, it's cold. I had sleet coming down tonight on my way home from work. Now I live in Philly. I don't live in Nashville, but still, it's starting to get cold up here. So some of those guys who've never played in the cold are going to get a little bit of an experience that's a little bit different. Ball slips out, guys. If you're going to run the ball, if there's any sort of weather, it can get uncomfortable pretty quick. So you got those things. The other thing is, look, Florida has been inconsistent all year long. And so the idea that they're going to put together 4 good quarters against Vanderbilt, I think is probably misguided. I think what you're going to find they'll put together a good half. They'll put together maybe a good first quarter and third quarter, or a good second quarter and fourth quarter. And the question is going to be, can they tread water in the quarters where they're not necessarily clicking on all cylinders. So look, the South Carolina game was a blowout because South Carolina turned the ball over 3 times in a third quarter where Florida basically did nothing on offense. And if South Carolina didn't turn the ball over, if they'd driven down the field and gotten a touchdown on that opening drive, well, now you sit there and you pucker up a little bit because now you got to do something on offense. And Florida just sputtered in the third quarter. Now, whether that's because they took their foot off the gas because they were basically just trying to deflate and get the game over with, that hey, let's not expose Anthony Richardson to anything else because they didn't run him very much in the second half. Whether they changed their game plan just because they were ahead, that's something that only they know. But they were inconsistent, right? In the third quarter, they were not the same offense that they were in the first quarter or even the second quarter. And I think you're going to see some inconsistency in this one as well. I think you'll see some inconsistency from the defense. They are not as good as they showed against South Carolina, but I think they're better than they've shown in some of these games this year so far. And I don't think Vanderbilt has the horses to take advantage of it. So, look, are they going to shut out Vanderbilt? I don't think so. Is it a game where you're going to say, well, that could have gone the other way? I think, yeah. But I mean, there's a reason why Florida's a 2-touchdown favorite. I mean, that's really, I think, whether it's 28-14 or whether it's 42 to 28, I think that's probably about right in terms of Florida's just a more talented team and it is going to be for the foreseeable future. Now, the one thing I will say is that Vanderbilt does not beat themselves. So the last 2 weeks when I've looked at Texas A&M and I've looked at South Carolina, they've given up a ton of tackle for losses. There is a lot of times that the defense has been in the backfield, and not coincidentally, Florida's not giving up a whole lot of rushing yards to those teams. Well, Vanderbilt has actually given up less tackles for loss this year, 41, than Florida has, 43. There are some offensive line stats that suggest that maybe Vanderbilt isn't quite as good as that. The point is they're not going to have a bunch of negative plays. So if they run the ball for 2 yards and then they run the ball for 2 yards, and now you're sitting there at 3rd and 6, Florida has not been able to get off the field on 3rd and 6 all year. They've been able to get off the field the last couple of weeks on 3rd and 11, 3rd and 12, but 3rd and 6, they have not been able to get off the field pretty much all year. And so, look, there's going to be this may feel like the USF game, right? Where you sit there and you look at it, God, like we should be ahead by 40. And, all of a sudden there's an interception, they score a touchdown. Holy crap, we're behind. Like, how did that happen? That might be what happens. I don't think so, but that might be what happens. But again, like, every advanced stat says Florida's the better team. Every general stat says Florida's the better team. From a quarterback perspective, I think Wright has a little bit better, has a better quarterback rating and a better yards above replacement than Anthony Richardson. So Richardson's going to have to be on for Florida to have an advantage there. And so that is if Richardson goes out and plays like he did against South Carolina and is inaccurate and Pearsall's out there turning to his right and the ball's to his left and those sorts of things, Vanderbilt might be able to hang. If Richardson comes out and just plays average, Florida wins this thing by 3 touchdowns. And that's really sort of, I think, where things are probably going to head.
Yeah, just always a little bit of ugliness with Vanderbilt. Just always seems to be that way. Hey, looking ahead, we're not the players. The players need to be focused on Vandy, but well, I'm actually looking ahead a little bit here. This FSU game this is definitely the best matchup since 2012. But Florida State, for as good of a rivalry as that's been over the past, I don't know, 30 plus years, the last decade plus has been one team is up and one team is down pretty consistently. You could even say maybe back into the 15. It's been about 15 years of that. Like, one team usually is up, one team's usually down. The games aren't always that great with Florida State. This game here, you might have two programs peaking at the right time. Interestingly enough, Florida State, they played Louisiana. So a little Billy Napier action there. Maybe he's got some he can hit up his buddies over there in Lafayette and get a little extra scouting report on the Noles a week early. So it'll be interesting to see both these programs coming in. Certainly Florida State is not a program that we expected to be where they did. You think they'd be 7-3, potentially 8-3 coming into the Florida game? Because I absolutely did not.
No, I don't think so. I think this is one where we say Jordan Travis has been a lot better than he was last year. And Travis was okay last year. He's taken a step forward. 20 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. He's run for 246 yards and 3 touchdowns. He was much more of a dual threat quarterback last year than he's been this year, but he's been very, very good through the air. And the fact that Travis has been able to take that step forward has made their offense really, really good. Their defense has been pretty nasty. And so, look, I think there are, I think it's a good thing. Again, I said this earlier about LSU and Georgia and Alabama. I think it's a good thing when your rivals are good. I still think you want to beat them all the time. And I think this is, in some cases, smoke and mirrors for Florida State in some ways, just from the standpoint of from the standpoint of their recruiting does not dictate that they're going to be like an all-time program. But look, if you have recruiting in the 15 to 20 range over and over and over again, you're going to have seasons where you go 9-2. You're going to have seasons, or 9-3. You're going to have seasons where you go, but you're also going to have seasons where you go 5-6. And so, when Travis leaves, that's where Norvell, the rubber's going to have to meet the road, because he's got a guy who's sort of covering up some of his sins right now. But look, they're 29th overall in the country at 34 points a game. They're 13th in the country, only giving up 18 points a game. Now, I think the thing that you would point to is that LSU game that they played was very early in the LSU tenure. The 47-7 win over Duquesne, not the most impressive thing. They have a 1-score win over Louisville. Then they play Boston College. They're not great. They lose to Wake Forest, North Carolina State, and Clemson. So when they played good teams in the ACC, they lost. Then they beat Georgia Tech. I mean, they've already fired their coach. They beat Miami. Miami should fire their coach just because of his game day stuff. And then they beat Syracuse, who's really not that good. They got Louisiana this week and then Florida. So from the standpoint of like, who have they played? The team you would point to is LSU. And do we really believe that LSU back then is who LSU is now? I mean, LSU turned it on against Florida, and certainly I think Florida's defense had something to do with that. But they've been good ever since that game. They were not good in that game against Florida State. Florida State tried to hand them that game in the worst way and just couldn't do it. So Florida State deserves to be ranked in the top 25. There's no doubt about it. I think their defense is nasty. I think Jordan Travis is pretty good. But I think Florida has a lot of things going for it too. You're going to need a good performance from Anthony Richardson to win that one too. And that's really the theme, right? Is when Richardson runs the ball, Florida scores 35 points and they have a shot to beat anybody. This is the last game of the year. You got, 4 weeks off before any sort of bowl game. They're getting more and more comfortable with Jalen Kitna being behind Richardson if anything were to happen to him. And so, this is the game where you sit there and go, we need to win this one because we want to, it's not this year's recruiting, but I think Sykes had a stat like, it was something like for 12 straight years, the team that won this Florida State game had a better recruiting class, the class after the game, right? So if you won in 2018, your 2020 class was better, right? Your 2019 class was what it was, but your 2020 class was better by winning this rivalry. So I think there is something to that. I think certainly, we've seen Roderick Kearney flip from Florida State to Florida. Florida State, from a recruiting standpoint under Norvell, has been rather limited. And I think what Noles fans are hoping is that if you can win this game, well, now you've beaten Miami and Florida, and you can hang that over them when you go out on the recruiting trail. I don't think that's going to work. I don't think it's the way recruiting works. Florida State spent an awful lot of money getting rid of their coaches over the last few years, which means there's probably not as much money in the NIL coffers as there are at Miami and Florida. But look, I mean, you want to beat your rivals. I think this is a challenge. This is not something where you say, oh yeah, this is the Florida State game last year where Florida was awful, but Florida State was just as bad. And that game was really hard to watch last year. And I don't think that's going to be the case this year. I think it's going to be fun to watch, and that's good, right? I want Florida State to be good. I just then want them to lose to Florida. I want Georgia to be good. And then I want Florida to just rip their hearts out, right? I want LSU to be good. And then I want Brian Kelly to have to babble in his Southern accent all the way back to Baton Rouge after Florida's rung him like a bell, right? Like, that's what makes it fun. It's no fun beating a team by 50. Now, it's fun beating them sometimes, but it's not fun beating a rival by 50 year after year after year where you just go, oh, Butch Jones again. Isn't that cute?
Sign me up for that with Georgia. I'll take that again. I'll take that. I'm okay with that.
All right. I'll agree with you.
You're giving a little too much credit. I just think it's going to be a final SEC game of the year. Well, leading into Florida State here, Thanksgiving next week. Man, the season flew by quickly. It always does, though. College football is always like that.
It does, and that's the thing, right? And I even said this, I think, coming out of the Georgia game, is we only get 12 of these, so enjoy them. Because there was somebody who, a woman named Monica, had tweeted about like the game against South Carolina was probably the last one she was going to get to watch with her dad. You could see he was in hospice, and she had his hand, and it tweeted out that was the last game that they were going to spend together. And you just look at that and go, like, that is, to me, college football from the standpoint of it is a relationship oriented thing, right? That Florida. So I'm a Buffalo Bills fan. They drive me crazy. They decide to kick me in the nuts from time to time, but that's not the team that I'm going to sit there and like watch religiously with my children as they get older. Like that's not the connection that we're going to have. The connection is going to be around Florida, whether they go there or not. Right. My 7-year-old is already a diehard Florida fan. I took him to one game and he's still and he's asking when to go back. So the connection there that you make in all these things is really to me the critical aspect of it. And that's why I said earlier that the build is the fun part, right? Like the fact that I can call my brother and we can go back and forth and talk about how stupid something was, why'd Napier make that call? What's going on? And that sort of stuff. We do the same thing on these podcasts, right? As we sort of go through, I mean, in many ways, I feel like we sort of talk about it the way I would, with my brother or my buddies, right? When we're sitting here talking. And that is the value of these seasons. So you got 12 of them. It's 12 opportunities to hang out with your buddies and talk about something that everybody has in common. And you think about like the world today and sort of how nobody has anything in common. This is something that we all have in common. And so enjoy it, right? Like enjoy it. It's trivial in the grand scheme of things, but it's not trivial in the grand scheme of things. And that's sort of what the tweet by Monica reminded me of is, in 2022, Florida playing Vanderbilt is trivial. But there's somebody out there who's watching that with their dad, and it's going to be the last opportunity they had to watch a game with their dad. Or there's somebody out there who's watching it with their brother, and they're going to have some sort of argument, and that'll be the last time they have an opportunity to spend time together. And that's what this is about, and it's not trivial. And so enjoy it while you got it.
Well said. Well said. Hey, you did a hit on 1010 XL in Jacksonville. You want to tell people where you can find that?
Yeah. So, Ryan Green, obviously the hacker, Tuesday night, it's going to be up there on 1010 in Jacksonville. You can find he's tweeted about it as well. We talked about some of the same things we talked about tonight, but, he was interested in Rashada, my comments there. Just more than anything, anybody who wants to go and retweet that, support us on there specifically. Obviously, exposure in the Jacksonville area is great. So thanks to Hacker for having me on and promoting the website, promoting the podcast, and really appreciate the forum, but also everybody who sort of helped us get to that point where, people who are prominent in media down there in Florida are seeing the articles on Read and Reaction and enjoying them enough to reach out and have us on.
And you can find that replay on SoundCloud, I believe. Correct?
Yep.
Yeah. 1010 XL in Jacksonville on SoundCloud. Just look for Ryan the Hacker Green. All right. That's our show this week. We're back. We'll be back next week. We'll do a pre-Thanksgiving episode. We might have to do it a little earlier in the week, Will, on that one, but we'll get it done. We'll get it done. We'll be back after our pre-hiatus. Thanks again for joining Stand Up and Holler. For Will Miles and Nick Knudsen. Have a great weekend. Go Gators.
Go Gators.
Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel. Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week, and check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles, and as always, go Gators.